was just waiting for the... Okay, so if everyone would like to take their seats, please. My name is Louise Olsen. I am not Torunn Tryggestad, as you see. I am stepping in for her this morning as she is unfortunately at home ill. So it is for me to welcome you to this seminar on the long road to justice, survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And conflict-related sexual violence is unfortunately a form of violence that remains as current as ever. For a period, it seemed like we were moving in the right direction. There were sort of the need to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence and improve the legal protection were areas in women, peace and security that actually saw progress. We saw more and more states and a growing increased sort of global agreement on this issue. And research by Benson and Gisselis also show that violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina contributed to improve the understanding of the seriousness of this form of violence by the Security Council and in many states. For instance, resulting in the Council increasing the likelihood that it actually intervened in conflicts. However, this was also a realization that conflict-related sexual violence bear heavy costs. It leaves scars in people, societies, and between countries over time. So it's a very costly form of violence. However, in recent years, conflict-related sexual violence have again become part of the sort of the increasing polarization on women, peace and security, and also the global backlash of women's rights that we see. For instance, I attended a meeting in the Security Council a while back where a report on the conflict-related sexual violence in the Israel and Palestine wars were presented. And I think this was the first time I actually saw armed guards at the UN security debate on women, peace and security. And I think this growing backlash really underlines the seriousness and the importance of this seminar today. We are very proud to welcome Professor Olivera Simić to PRIO to share her research and her experiences. Professor Simić is from the Griffith University. She's a feminist and a human rights activist born in former Yugoslavia and also lived through the Yugoslav wars 91 to 99. She was 19 years old, studying her first year of law degree in Bosnia and Herzegovina when the war in Bosnia broke out in 92. And in 2014, Professor Simić published her memoirs, Surviving Peace, a political memoir based on these experiences. Professor Simić has also published numerous books, chapters, articles, and personal narratives where people who struggle with post-war trauma and seek some form of justice is at the heart. Her book, Lawless War, Rape Without Punishment, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2023, and her book, Madam War Criminal, Biljana Plavic, Serbia's Iron Lady, was published by Hearst in October last year. And for those of you who are interested in this book, contact Skjelsbæk. There are also possibilities to buy some copies after the seminar. Dr. Simić has also been a nominee for the Penny Peather Prize for Scholarship in Law, Literature and Humanities and has also won the Peace Women Award for from International Women's Peace League for Peace and Freedom. Now, Professor Simić will first give a talk, and after that we will see a short conversation with Skjelsbæk, who is a professor at PRIO, but also at the University of Oslo, and also written extensively on the flights of survivors in the Bosnian War. For instance, she published a book in 1924 called Sarajevo's Roses, which was nominated for the Brage Prize last year. So the event is organized by the PRIO Center for Gender, Peace and Security, and it is also streamed online, so I would very much welcome everyone who is also joining us online. And I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Hoda Dedic, who is the Bosnian ambassador to Norway. Thank you for being here today. So, Professor Simić, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Many thanks for these kind introductions, Louise. And first of all, I would just like to briefly thank to Professor Inger Skjelsbæk, Professor Torunn, Tryggestad, and Peace Research Institute for bringing me over here, and to Asha Ali for organizing my trip and logistics of the trip. So I'm very excited to be invited to speak about some achievements and some remaining gaps in addressing conflict-related sexual violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As a way of introduction, I know Louise said a few things about me. I'm just going to say a little bit briefly about me as a way of introducing you to the topic. So I will start by saying that I'm a Bosnian Australian woman. I teach and research in international law, war crimes, and transitional justice, and my research focuses primarily on my country of birth, the country that doesn't exist any longer in the shape and form that I was born in. That's the former Yugoslavia. But I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and when the 1990s war started, I was 18, 19 years old. I left the country, and I think this is one of the untold stories. I'm very interested in stories that are silenced and unspoken. So this is what I'm going to say, one of these stories, because I left the country after I being asked to, and actually I went there to pick up the uniform with my father and join the territorial defense in my hometown of Banja Luka. So that was a trigger for my parents to put me on the bus outside of the country, because my brother, who was 21 at that time, he was already drafted into the war. And I still think that after 30 years, we know very little about women, young women, who just finished their high school, especially those ones who finished medical school that were asked to be drafted and help war effort. That's one of the topics that hasn't been researched. So when people say there has been so much research done in Bosnia, in particular on women survivors, there's always something to look for that hasn't been, and this is one of these stories. My research is qualitative, meaning that I listen to and document stories of survivors, in particular women survivors, and over the past decade, stories of perpetrators too, which brings another layer of ethical and other challenges that I would be happy to discuss if time permits. As you all know, last year, Bosnia commemorated several significant events, and one of which was the signing of Dayton Peace Agreement, which ended the armed conflict in the country. And another one was the genocide in Srebrenica that happened in July 1995, when the Bosnian Serb army killed over 8,000 men and boys and some women too. So although the war ended in 1995, there hasn't been, I would say, much to celebrate, apart from the fact, of course, which is huge, that bloodshed ended and has not resumed, which is a great accomplishment, since we know how difficult, and we heard in the introductory remark, is really how difficult it is to keep the peace, in particular in those conflicts that have been asymmetrical and internal. So the war has been was ended in 1995 by the signing of Dayton Peace Agreement, but the conflict and the strong tensions between different ethnicities or ethnic groups that waged war has never really kind of ended. It just continued, as we'll say, with different ways and with different means. So I don't think that Bosnia really ever succeeded in transitioning from negative to positive peace. And also, as Bosnians like to say, the war is today, or over the last 3 decades, waged not with guns and grenades, but with hearts and minds. Dayton Peace Agreement has produced the world's most convoluted constitutional regime, and as a result, the situation in Bosnia, I think, remains of a serious concern, and constantly seemingly at the risk of some new kind of violence between the 3 largest ethnic groups over there. So it's still going through, the country is still going through the transition, I would say, to fully democratic state where state institutions are not fragile and are not often paralyzed by political and administrative division of the country into entities in one district. So the 1990s war left more than 100,000 people dead, 2.3 million displaced. And one of its key features that, as you would know, that attracted attention from international and feminist scholars was the pervasive use of rape and other forms of sexual violence. According to the United Nations, there were around 20,000 women, men, and minors who were raped during the Bosnian War between 1992 and 1995. Many of these rapes occurred in camps and other places of makeshift detention. Bosnian women survivors paved the way in international criminal law and jurisprudence by testifying before the first ad hoc international court established after the Second World War, International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, which tried conflict-related sexual violence, war-related violence cases. In large part, this has happened due to incredible work and lobbying of feminist justice scholars. Apart from this international justice that was there for survivors to achieve some sort of justice, Bosnia and Herzegovina itself started with domestic trials in 2004 when War Crimes Chamber in Sarajevo was established. However, progress towards accountability for war crimes has been very slow, with investigations, prosecutions, and Bosnian court proceedings taking years. Maybe I could just say briefly here that at this moment, or last 2 years, we just finished a draft together with my colleague prosecutor, Mirsad Pružan, state prosecutor, former state prosecutor Mirsad Pružan. We are working on a study for UN Women about investigations, covering 20 years of investigations, prosecutions, sentencing, everything around sexual violence in war. And we hope this study will be of help to other nations who are waging war and hopefully will soon get to the peace agreement and starting with war crime prosecutions, or have already started with war crime prosecutions for sexual violence like Ukraine, and maybe offer some lessons learned. I'm just going to tell you a few things around domestic judiciary and maybe some numbers that would be interesting. So by the end of 2024, the domestic judiciary had adjudicated, that's in Bosnia, around 800 war crime cases involving around 1,200 defendants. Around 1/4 of all adjudicated war crime cases involves conflict-related sexual violence. While this is a welcome achievement, if we have in mind that we are talking around 20,000 survivors, and that approximately 400 individuals over the past 30 years have been altogether prosecuted. So that's before the ICTY that prosecuted 32 and the rest before the Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The numbers of those who were not prosecuted for these crimes can be measured really in thousands. And presumably most of them are still walking free. Also, we should keep in mind, or I would like to remind you, that many of those prosecuted have already served their sentences or were released early, and some of them returned to their pre-war homes, and their victims meet them on the street. So that's what survivors of this crime will tell you, that it's not unusual to meet their rapists on the street because they have been released, they served their sentence, and they went back at the same places where their victims today live. According to some estimations, no one has really concrete numbers and data around, but around 500 war criminals escaped justice and found refuge in neighboring countries, in particular in Croatia and Serbia, but they're also all over the world. And among these 500 war criminals are those ones who were under investigation, those ones who were convicted and then escaped. This is just estimation. As I said, we are not really sure, but this is the number that comes up, or most recently came up in the media, because no one, I tried to find from the courts and prosecutors whether there is any data or database about these people, but there has been really nothing. At this moment, before the prosecutor office in Bosnia, there are around 3,000 reported war crimes that lack an identified suspect or where the commission of crime is still suspected. And many of these cases with unidentified suspects will remain open forever, as there is no statute of limitations for war crimes. And there are around 2,900 of suspects that cannot be identified. So we know that there is a possible war crime, but there is not enough evidence for the war crime, and then there is not enough evidence who the suspects are. So, and you can imagine that, again, most of these people are living around in the same country, walking maybe the same streets with victim survivors, witnesses, etc. So the risk of, or fear that these women have is still real and is still present in 2026. And in my book, Lola's War, I took a story of one woman. I wrote about her rapist who was convicted on 7 years in prison, but he was first acquitted, and then after appeal he was convicted, and he used this time before, while waiting for appeal and while being convicted finally in the second instance, to leave the country. And he's, as far as we know, we know he's in Croatia, and Lola can follow him basically on the Facebook. This is not an unusual story. Most of these war criminals you can find on the Facebook, and some women that I talked to found them too. So he basically, in this case, Lola's defendant, he spent basically instead of spending his time in jail, he spent his time just living as a free man in neighboring Croatia. Most of them have dual citizens, so that's why that's possible, and they are not extradited back to Bosnia to serve their sentences. That's a whole another topic of mine, but I thought these are just some interesting things, quite depressing, but that's how it is, trying to map what's going on actually there when it comes also to survivors of and justice brought to them or not brought to them. The Bosnian judiciary also has a problematic clause that allow war crime sentences up to 1 year, and there are such war crime sentences up to 1 year to be replaced with monetary fine. So what courts have done, they would apply mitigating circumstances to commute 1 year prison terms to fines. And we know that they've done so, and at least you can read about this. Trial International has done a great job in studying these cases. So at least 14 cases, including conflict-related sexual violence cases, since 2012, have been with this practice where people who were convicted for wartime rape were convicted on 1 year, and they could just pay fine and walk free. So the proposal to abolish this practice did not yet pass the Bosnian Parliamentary Assembly. What this means is that really, as I said, defendants can be sentenced to only 1 year for wartime rape, and then they can go ahead, replace imprisonment with a fine, and go home. So you can imagine how that such decisions really can impact women's victims' lives. And as far as I'm aware, Bosnia is really unique in allowing such distortion of justice to persist, and we don't understand why is this still happening and why this practice cannot be abolished. I mean, women NGOs in Bosnia have done enormous work year after year to try to abolish this, but it's still there. After years of struggle to obtain also recognition of their existence and their status, as well as the long-lasting psychological, economic, and social impact on their everyday lives, children born as a result of wartime rape have at last been acknowledged as civilian victims of war for the first time, but still not on the whole territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So they were first recognized in July 2022, when the Brčko district recognized children born of rape as a special category of civilian victims of war. In August 2023, these children were recognized by the Federation of Bosnia. Republika Srpska entity did not recognize children as a special category of victims. And it also does not have, indeed, any more laws on protection of victims of war torture that recognize women as survivors of wartime rape as a special category of victims. So the deadline for victims to submit requests to request their status and exercise their rights in Republika Srpska expired in October 2023. So at the moment there is no laws on victims of torture. There is no possibility for women and survivor and men as well who survived torture and who survived conflict-related sexual violence to actually apply to get status of civilian victim of war, which is very important for, of course, for survivors because, among other things, gives them access to material compensation, right? So that's no more possibility in Republika Srpska. So again, women NGOs try to put pressure on Republika Srpska government to do so, to prolong the law for at least next 5 years. They rejected to do so. Most victims of conflict-related sexual violence have yet to receive reparations for the crimes committed against them. Only 1,080 victims of conflict-related sexual violence obtained the status of civilian victims of war and received some form of material compensation for the harm. These material reparations are kind of like pensions that they are not reparations in a full sense, but they are like but monthly payments that survivors receive. Yeah. These are very low. I think in Republika Srpska it's only around 200 euros or something per month. And although many of these victims really live in poverty, in very difficult situation, many of them have lost husbands during the war. They stayed as a single mothers, single parents. There is a huge unemployment in Bosnia. So this is a just symbolic kind of money, material compensation for them. And some of them, such as Lola, told me that she is actually, of course, aware how little it's that, and she feels humiliated that she has to take 200 euros for what she survived. But because she has no other income, there is no other way or option for her to earn money. She hasn't been able to work, as many women, due to psychological distress and physical and health consequences from them being detained in rape camps. They could really not really go into full workforce after that. The other thing that I want to say, and I wrote about this hierarchy of victimhood, that some victims' narratives have been more prominent in the public than others, that there are still, and I think that the perceptions of victimhood are based primarily on ethnicity. So ethnicity rather than gender plays a role into recognition of victims and recognition who is going to be visible and who is going to stay invisible. So there are a lot of the narratives, again, if you think that everything has been said about Bosnia and maybe about rape in Bosnia, I would always argue, no, it's not. And to think about which women voices haven't been heard, what kind of research hasn't been done. So, for example, we know nothing about Roma women, and we know about war cases, and we know at least about one case where there was a case of sexual slavery of the Roma community, and where a lot of women being held in sexual slavery by paramilitary Serbian army. But I haven't read any research or their experiences about this. So there are these narratives of other minority within minority groups of women who are still maybe waiting to tell their stories. So they are pretty much still excluded from also our feminist focus and study. So also prosecutions and retributive justice have been privileged over reparation, a mechanism that primarily serves victims' needs. One of the things, of course, that in order to get material reparation, one needs to go through criminal prosecutions if you want to get to material. And that's not something unique to Bosnia, but it's putting pressure on women actually to go through criminal proceedings, even if they don't want to go to, be witnesses in their cases, which many of them fear to do or, feel re-traumatized if they do so. But that's the only way to get to that other way and then apply to get civilian status of war and by proving that you were a victim of that particular crime. So, but the reparations have never been approached really in Bosnia also as national strategy, and many things haven't, but that's one of the things that hasn't been approached as a national strategy, but as a piecemeal kind of project of each of the two Bosnian entities. So almost 3 decades after the war, Bosnia still lacks a national legal framework that ensures effective access to full material reparation to all women victims of wartime rape. When it comes to symbolic reparation, which I think are also very important, maybe because I teach transitional justice, I always say very few women, and this is again not something to Bosnia, it's universal, are going to get material reparations. Governments are shying away, all governments are shying away to acknowledge the victim, the women victims or victims of war, because material compensation involves money, large sums of money that have to be given to victims. But symbolic reparations are also very important, and I think really that whole process in Bosnia was for women victims carried by women NGOs. So from the bottom top, the masses of women NGOs have done street vigils, exhibitions, movies, street performances, arts that also have been able to move some things along. So film Grbavica by Jasmila Žbanović, which I would say it's a symbolic reparation, actually moved laws in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina thanks to that movie. It was lobbied around this movie, and women survivors of wartime rape received recognition and laws to be able to apply for a special category of civilian victims of war. The very first monuments to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence is in the making, and December 10 is marked by women NGOs as a day of remembrance of all women victims of war. That was another thing that women NGOs wanted to lobby the government to make December 10 as official day of remembrance. That never happened, but they still organized themselves on December 10 to pay tribute and commemorate all women victims of war. So these initiatives have, as I said, largely been rolled out by local human rights NGOs, activists, and artists in Bosnia. So just to maybe, and speaking of symbolic reparation, I'm going to finish now. The Bosnian government has never issued a public apology, or all, political elites, let's say, to victims of war crimes, including victims of wartime sexual violence, or acknowledge their suffering in any other symbolic way. Imam or Islamic community in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So this is another thing to, if you're still interested to do some research in Bosnia, to research the role of religion in the war and also in transitional justice. And I think one remarkable thing to say is that Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina have publicly endorsed the women survivors of wartime sexual violence and send that message that these women should be embraced by their communities. And I thought that was really something really important and big. Yeah. So for many victims of war, retributive justice is kind of justice, and achieving that justice prosecution seems only meaningful. But I think as the time passed, that's less and less, as we know that 30 years on, we have less victims, unfortunately, also less perpetrators, and less prosecutions happening because of so much time that has been passed and biological clock is there. But for them, it's important because, as I said, this paves the way to get material compensation for the harm that has been done to them. And I'm going to finish with just one anecdote or little story that I like to share when I talk about really this post-conflict situation or in Bosnia. And I mentioned that many perpetrators of war crimes, not just wartime rape, they walk the streets in Bosnia, and that around 500 of them escape justice. Some of these who return to their communities, as I said, they meet their victims on the street because they live again in the same town. So Nusreta Sivac, who was in Omarska camp, one of the first witnesses, one of the first cases before the ICTY. She testified in, as I said, in one of the first cases, and one of her rapists was he was released in 2005 after he served 2/3 of his 7-year prison sentence. And Sivac told this story. She met him one day on the streets of Prijedor, and she said, we looked at each other for a long time, but then he was the first one to lower his head. And I put my chin up and went on my way. And I thought this is a story that tells a story about transitional justice. And after this post-conviction life, because these people are back there, and this is what you can do to still keep to your dignity and pride. And I thought this is just incredible story of courageous and pride and dignity that Nusreta shared with us. So I'm going to stop here, and then we can continue talking. Thank you. Just grab some water. Can I get some water?
There's some water here.
Water here.
Hey. Well, that was a good ending, in a way. But thank you, Olivera, for your reflections. And for all your writing that I have read, but I still have things left to read that you have written. But I wanted to maybe start to ask you, about transitional justice and, the situation we're in today. Is there a little thing with the sound? In a way, the 1990s, post-Bosnia, I would say, or post the wars in the Balkans, there was this optimism. Okay, is this turned off then? Yeah. There was this optimism that we could kind of get things right, that transitional justice would have a reconciliatory effect. Can you hear me? Criminal justice was part of this. And now so many years have passed, we're in a different place altogether. So much has been written and so much has been learned. But, and in a way, we have a lot of documentation about things that have gone wrong. How does this not work the way we intended and hoped for it to work? But if you think about it, based on what you've researched and the knowledge we have about the criminal prosecution, and the efforts for reconciliation in the Bosnian context or in the Balkan context, maybe larger, acknowledging also we have the Kosovo ambassador also came, so we have more countries here. What are the major gains you see from these processes? If we start on an optimistic note, what are the major gains when we have all this knowledge about the imperfections, let's say?
And then we can come back to criminal prosecutions and reconciliation, because that's very important to talk about this. Criminal prosecutions are not without other conditions that they are not going to bring to reconciliation. So there needs to be some other things done in order for that to happen. And I'm not thinking that criminal prosecutions can prosecute everyone and resolve all issues they want. However, having said that, so that's pessimistic note. Optimistic is that they are very important. I'm still, of course, saying that international criminal prosecutions, domestic and international prosecutions, are very important for many reasons, and we especially the ICTY criminal prosecutions and tribunal brought to the fore wartime rape. Before that, we didn't have prosecutions, really. We had a little bit mentioned before the Nuremberg, but not really prosecutions in the sense that we had. So that was a groundbreaking, and it's very important because it sends a message that these are important crimes, these are internationally recognized crimes, that we recognize women who went through these terrible experiences, and that these crimes are worthy of prosecuting, and that no one should, and there is another question of accountability, that people who have done this are going to be accountable sooner or later, even if they don't, because many of them don't. That's just reality. I know that we have in the Ukraine, for example, 150,000 war crimes. Who knows how many perpetrators, maybe 300,000, 500,000. It's impossible. No justice system can prosecute all these people, but it sends message that at least those ones who, I like to say, those ones who committed crimes, they have to look over their shoulder till the rest of their lives. And that's, for me, also some kind of punishment, because I think they have to think about whether one day someone is going to come to knock to their door and arrest them. So it's important that jurisprudence that was developed from international domestic tribunals is very important for development of international law, but this recognition of the harm for women and acknowledgement that this is a serious war crime is very important for women.
Thank you. In your work, you have focused on marginalized voices and the marginalized within the marginalized often. The book about Lola that you mentioned a few times in your presentation is about a Serbian war rape survivor or victim. And then you have this book here also about Biljana Plavsic, who was the only woman ever, I think,
Yes.
to have been convicted for war crimes. And it's a painful book to read, and I recommend everyone to read it, also because in no way does she regret what she has been part of or initiated, which also says a bit also about the prosecution that she went through and the impact that had on her, which is maybe not one would have hoped. But having focused on these marginalized voices within the marginalized, why is it important for you to focus on women's voices as such, or the marginalized women voices within the marginalized voices? What is it that brings to the fore as you see it?
So there is Lola's War is, as you mentioned, a book about Bosnian Serb woman who was in Croatian detention camp, and I met that woman when I did the first study on Serb women victims of wartime rape in 2015, because I noticed there hasn't been any stories also collected by the Serb women in Republika Srpska, and Gender Center in Republika Srpska asked me if I can go and find these women and just document their stories, and that's how I met Lola and documented her story, which I think that really book reads as a thriller, because I said her convicted rapist is not in the jail, but he is still free and at large. I think the Plavsic is very different. She is the first woman ever prosecuted in the history of international tribunals, ever first woman high-ranking politician, ex-president. We had women who were prosecuted. We have around 50 women before domestic courts in Bosnia prosecuted for war crimes, and we had before one in Rwanda, and the rest in the Nazi women who were engaged in war crimes. But she is the first woman high-ranking ex-president ever prosecuted before, not just in the ICTY, but also in history. I don't know whether I would call her marginalized. She was a very privileged woman. I'm not going to go into the story about Plavsic, but I think why it's important to talk about women. Women do disrupt these often stereotyped narratives about the war, or that men wage war, women are just victims, or that also what they did with your work and work of all feminist scholars and women scholars who are interested in peace and conflict studies, and they bring these women's voices to the forum because they tell different narratives from the usual historical narratives of war. So usual historical narratives of war, as you know, literature was about the battlefields and about men who were dying as heroic heroes for the country. And then what this brought is actually saying the story of trauma, the story of also combat-related trauma, the story of war veterans, traumatized war veterans. It all started also with the women's stories and women speaking about, not just about themselves, you know, before many Truth Reconciliation Commission comes to mind, South Africa, Truth Reconciliation Commission, women did talk about, rather than about themselves, about their sons and husbands. But I think they do disrupt the common narrative, and I'm interested in women's stories because simply they are missing from the histories. And then, as I said in my talk, I'm very interested in these silence narratives and always ask myself, who are the women or men who we haven't heard? So which stories we didn't collect, and then I ask why. As a researcher, why is this the case? And then you go and explore the socio-political environment that doesn't allow maybe for some stories to come up in these hierarchies of victimhood. So, and I think it's important to document all stories as it's also, for me, writing about these stories is a way of symbolic justice and giving something back and documenting for the history and giving respect to women who survived this. So I think they definitely bring some other perspective and shines and different lights on the war, and these stories are very important.
But then the story about Biljana Plausic is also about perpetrators.
Yes.
And having worked with the victims and survivors' perspectives, and then moving on to doing research on perpetrators, you debate that quite a bit in your book and talk about the ethical challenges that you have struggled with. Could you share a little bit about that?
I will.
I think that's very interesting to hear.
Yeah, I will share a little bit. So for 20 years, I've written about women survivors, about women peace builders, women activists, and then about 10 years ago, I was editing a special issue with my colleague, and it was about ICTY, so we call them ICTY celebrities, looking at all these people who were convicted and released, and then coming back to Belgrade or Zagreb, you know, with red carpets, welcomed by their governments. And, you know, I was just in shock, you know, and you have to be in shock when you're, again, that's another thing. And it's good to be in shock, you know, after 20 years, if you're still kind of shocked with some things. That's I always said to my students, I said, that's a really good thing, because you need that. That's a motivator to do something. And rage is good. Anger can be positive because it moves you to correct these injustices. But because my work is qualitative, I'm used to talk to people. So I said, I don't know any war criminal that I can talk to. I said, you know, because they disappear. I mean, they are not really low-ranking. Yeah, there's high-ranked war criminals. They are on TVs and in media. That's another fascinating topic. But in Serbia, also in Croatia, but in Serbia in particular, they are just everywhere. You know, and they teach in military academies after they serve their sentences, and they run the shows, TV shows, they go and to comment about wars and all sorts of things. Anyway, so the thing, but I was not interested in that story, maybe because of my personal, you know, experiences with wars and scars, and I did not want to have to do anything with perpetrators. I was just like, I'm not going to go there. I don't have any, even if I, you know, could do it, and I could with Plavšić, I was not ready. How I could do with Plavšić? Plavšić was a family friend, and I write about that, as Inger said, in introduction, and also in epilogue about ethics and methodology, which is like central for this work, because she was the best friend of my late aunt. So if you wonder how you can get access to someone who is ex-president, high-ranking, the only woman, that's the way. Bosnia is a small country. So there you have a family. And then I knew that my late beloved aunt, I grew up with her, I knew that they are friends. But at the time I was already living abroad. My aunt was living in Banja Luka, my hometown, where Plavšić also lived. And I won't go into details. I explain all this, how they met and how they became friends. But the fact is that they stayed friends all this time. So when she was arrested, convicted, Plavšić would call my aunt once a week. And so that relationship has been ongoing for past 30 years. My aunt died 3 years ago, Biljana Plavšić. She's still alive. But my colleague said, why don't you go and interview Biljana Plavšić? I said, I can't interview Biljana Plavšić. I just couldn't see myself doing that. Anyway, after some thinking, I asked my aunt if she would introduce me if I decided. She said, of course I would. But I was just very stressed, terrified, because no one does provide you any training on how to do interviews with victims or with perpetrators. And then I had to do first perpetrator Biljana Plavšić. I mean, really. So anyway, that's how it all started. I called her, and then it all started. I went to see her multiple times. I stayed with her over the phone, and she told me all this story. I was just thinking to write one paper, one article for the journal, focusing on her post-sentence life and rehabilitation after the sentence. That was what interests me. But that turned out to be 8 years almost, a relationship of almost 8 years, and me going there. And she gave me all archives. She has her written diaries in Sweden that I have with me. So I have all these artifacts sitting. I shouldn't say where. I'm showing it with my finger now. In Australia. Yeah. In Australia, I need to think what I'm going to do with it. And there are some negotiations now because she wanted to give me all this stuff. And at the end of this book, you will find some of the letters that she received. She was very popular. So she had a lot of fans, and she received a lot of letters. And she gave me those letters. And I reproduced some of those letters. I redacted the names. But just to give you an impression how people admired her, some people, yeah, that they would write to her. And I was thinking there is no really then much, I mean, among other things, but no miracle that she has never been repentant, has very high opinion of herself. And these people were feeding into this kind of picture because it's just, I was absolutely amazed. I just couldn't believe that people from all walks of life were writing, researchers, journalists, priests, whoever, I don't know. Many people have written to her to give her some sort of encouragement while she was in jail. So that was my first introduction to perpetrators, and with this, and I have written this book for many years. But it happened that way, kind of. It's not really, I don't really plan, oh, now I'm going to do this and sit and talk to her. It just really happened with her.
But you had a possibility, and you
I took
acted
that
on it. Yeah.
I acted on it. Yeah, I struggled a lot, and I struggled all the way speaking because, and I think, and I told Inger, for me, this book is full of ethics. You really, if you read it, you will think how difficult it is. It's very difficult to talk to perpetrator and not contradict, because you want to say many things, but that's not what you were supposed to do, because then you are in conflict, not a dialogue or monologue, actually, in this case. It wouldn't bring me anywhere if I would contradict it, because she is very sharp, very strict, very strong-willed. And, I mean, here and there I did that. But in the book, I'm telling what I didn't say, kind of, yeah? I'm challenging her in that way. So there is a lot of this internal dialogue of me there. So, but there is quite things to think about methodology and ethics a lot there.
And I think we could...
Being inside or being, especially, I mean, and I'm very upfront with that, because people are, how could you get to Biljana Plavšić? We tried many times. You said, I have an aunt, you know? And she's supposed to be, can you imagine, like, what a fate, stroke of fate, she happened to be the best friend with Plavšić. I mean, really. Anyway, so that's how that happened.
But I think also this, what? Yeah, you can. Can I just do one comment, and then I'll really open up? Just to say that, I think a major contribution of this book and your work is, you have humanized, not to excuse, but you humanize. I mean, no one is born a perpetrator nor a victim of war crimes. It happens, and there are some transformation processes and some very painful things that happen. And I think to bring out, we need more knowledge about the human side, while not agreeing with the people.
But that's the biggest risk, because you have to kind of humanize when you write a story about someone. Yeah. But at the same time, you run a huge risk of being seen and sided on perpetrator's side. And that's really walking that tightrope, how to do it without saying, okay, this is, of course, she's a human, and this is some of her life story that may give us understanding why she thought or did what she did, not excuse, but why, without going into that full humanization or, looking at me as someone who just embraced everything what she said. It's very, very difficult to do it. I think so.
I hear you. Now we open up for questions. And Nora,
Excuse me for being so impatient. I was so engaged with everything you said, and thank you so much. But I was wondering, what do you think was her wish with you? I mean, she's obviously made you her messenger. Right. And what were your thoughts about what she wanted, putting all these things on your shoulders in addition to talking? Thank you.
Thank you. I think, thank you for that question. I think, of course, and I also say that she used me to tell this story. I also, it was also something incredible for our career as a researcher. So we all both have seen something to maybe gain from this. Although I think for her main message was she knew that I will write in English, and this is for foreign English readers. It's not written because she, many people in Serbia, and there, of course, everyone knows who is she, and she said a few things, and she was in media, local media, a few times after she was released in 2009, but not, she never engaged with the English readers, and she knew through me that she can do that. So that's a kind of, but the main message, I think, and what I think from reviews that showed up, have been written by different commentators, and they write in the title of these interviews with me or something, unrepentant. And I think that was her main message. And if was that her main message, I think she could be happy with this book, because she starts, and she said several times, and she ends the book by saying that she has no regrets for anything, and she would do the same again. So the message of unrepentance is the one I think that she wants to go down the history with. And I think that she, from that perspective, succeeded, because that's what she wanted. But I have to say that I mean, we can speculate, but from my other research with other perpetrators and knowing the socio-political situation in context in which perpetrators also live and operate there, there is no much incentive and there is no much reward if people apologize, because regardless to which ethnic group they belong, if perpetrator apologize, and I can give you a lot of examples that I'm not going to, they are going to be ostracized from their community. So my assumption is she did repent and apologize in 2002 during her sentencing hearing. She said that she's sorry, After that, and that was just like spread like wildfire everywhere, and everyone praised her. However, I think at that moment she lost half of her Serb popularity of people. And I know her very close friends were saying she should have never done that. She should have never done that. She should never admit that Serbs committed crimes. 2 years later, she said, what I said was lie. And from then on, she keeps that narrative that that's not really what she, that she was not repentant and so forth, so on. And I think that fear of losing, and I know for other perpetrators who did apologize, they're completely ostracized and pariahs. They because denial of war crimes and denial of genocide is something that is rewarded in Bosnia or in Serbia, in Croatia, you don't talk about crimes of your own group, because that's going to alienate you from your own group. So, and that's not the position that anyone wants to really be, especially people who are trying to, perpetrators who are coming back from convicted release, trying to find their foot, to live again in the society. They are not going to publicly do that. And I can give you an example of Esad Lanjo, for example, who did that publicly, made a movie about that, but he was ostracized. Not just him, but many other people that tried to apologize. They were automatically dismissed as their remorse is fake, not giving any chance to maybe, or doubt, think maybe these people are really sincerely remorseful, because, as I said, it's just not socially accepted.
A little bit of time for more questions, if there
Please do ask me questions.
Yeah. Questions, if anyone. I forgot to use the mic. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation and the discussion. One thing you mentioned was that there are certain questions that you think that you're not raising, right? What are maybe the things that you're not asking? And this is what most researchers will do.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering how you think about how location impacts that. So what are the questions that your location permits you? And what are the questions that maybe researchers in Bosnia, in other parts of the region, are not permitted to raise? And how do you engage with this? Like, how do you think about the knowledge that is being produced across different social, political geographies, and how we might communicate, how researchers might communicate that between ourselves? Yes.
Thank you. That's a very good question, if I understood well. So definitely your place and position, which I always do in my work. I always say who I am, where I come from, etc. So I can go different ways in answering this question. I think there are several things that influence how you're going to research, who you're going to research. That can be funds. Most of researchers are going to move also to different topics and to different maybe victims depending on funding, depending on popularity. So for example, Bosnia, and this topic has been very popular, so to speak, for 20-something years. It's not anymore in the region, I think, as it was. So all researchers were just flocking there, international researchers trying to get interviews with women victims of wartime sexual violence, and usually going to same context. So we talk about research fatigue, because most of my colleagues would go to the same NGO, same women would speak, and you had some of these survivors who would repeat 50 times the same, and then you have the other women who never were asked anything. The positionality, of course, that being insider, for example, for me, I'm maybe probably more aware of some of the, some of the socio-political dynamics, of the cultural rituals, of everything that gives you kind of permission to go and do some things. Having said that, I think that when you are insider, you have maybe more risk to do with some of the groups. This research risk of being, for example, when I have been, whenever I publish something, I'm always under stress. I'm terrified, and I always joke, like, people celebrate their books. I said some of us don't celebrate our books. We are terrified how people will react, because it's they can read a lot of politics, take out of that context. So when I did my book on Lola, I think that was the first. That was the book and first substantial work with Serb women victims of war. And, after 20 years of writing about crimes committed by Serbs, and my ethnic origin is Serb, I wrote this book. So, and I thought, I could be immediately marked as, nationalist, or taken out of context, or say, here you go, this is undercover nationalist, as my father. And my father was very proud of me. He said, finally, like, you understand, like, what happened to us, right? So I play into this. You have to play into this kind of comments, But I think everything can bring its challenges and advantages, being insider. But writing, I think it also, not to sound pretentious, but it takes a bit of courage to write about these things. And I understand what younger researchers tell me, that they are afraid that they will step on someone's toe, that some women NGOs will close, not women NGOs, but NGOs will close their door if they write about this thing. And I think if you do this work, it's impossible not to take risk. Otherwise, you can't produce work that hasn't been produced, maybe. Yeah. But I understand it's very difficult. So I would never encourage anyone to put themselves in a danger. I can do that for my own work if I decide what I'm going to do. But it's not easy at all. So, and it depends also how you write. I always say that. I think that's a that skill of writing is very also important, how to write about these very, very sensitive topics. But in any case, when you write something like this, it can always be taken out of context, and I write about this. I was attacked about writing this book from everywhere were coming attacks. Why am I writing about wound perpetrator? As a feminist, why am I going to say something good? Am I a Serb apologist? Am I don't do this? Why she's a Madame War criminal? Why she is not Madame President? I said, why do you call her Madame War criminal? That's what I got from some fellow. I said, because she is. I mean, so there was a lot of this coming from different sides, kind of underlying, you know, how would I call it? You know, not even provocations, but yeah, it's not easy to write about it, and you never know. But I think we need, as researchers, you have to be curious, do things that haven't been done, and write it with decency and analytical thinking, and give to your colleagues and friends to read, to give you comments before you publish.
On that note, I think I'll put this up. On that note, we've reached the end of the hour. Thank you so much, Olivera, for sharing your insights, your thoughts, your reflections on the book. Thanks for everyone who came and for everyone who followed online. We could have talked a lot more, and I guess we will in a different form. So have a good day, everyone, and thanks again.
Thank you.